The old bell above the convenience store door jingled softly as Keanu Reeves stepped inside, shaking off the light drizzle clinging to his worn black jacket. He wasn't trying to be unnoticed. He never was. But years of living under the glare of fame had taught him to appreciate moments of solitude. The store was small, the kind of place where the aisles were narrow and the shelves were stacked with an odd assortment of essentials: chips, soda, batteries, and magazines with fading covers. Keanu strolled through the aisles, his fingers grazing a pack of beef jerky before deciding against it. The place smelled like cinnamon air freshener and coffee brewing behind the counter. Behind the register stood Jake, a young cashier barely out of high school, with dark curls peeking from under his baseball cap. He was scrolling on his phone, looking up only when Keanu approached the counter with a bottle of water and a chocolate bar. Jake barely glanced at him. "That'll be $3.75, he muttered, still half distracted. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. As he handed them over, Jake's eyes flickered up, really looking at him this time. Something about the man's face seemed familiar, like a memory just out of reach. He had that rugged, lived-in look, the kind people had when they'd seen too much of the world and still chose kindness. "You know," Jake said, frowning slightly, "you kinda look like Keanu Reeves." Keanu smiled, the corners of his lips quirking up in that effortlessly humble way of his. "I get that sometimes," he replied, his voice smooth but unassuming. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. If you were Keanu Reeves, you'd be driving some fancy sports car and buying like 100 of these chocolate bars." Keanu laughed, leaning on the counter slightly. "What if I told you I walked here?" Jake squinted, half intrigued, half skeptical. "Sure, and I'm the President of the United States." Keanu could have let it go. He could have simply thanked Jake, taken his water and chocolate, and walked back into the night. But something about the moment, perhaps the innocence of not being recognized, or the simple honesty in the kid's voice, made him pause. "Tell you what," Keanu said, his tone light but inviting. "If I was Keanu Reeves, what would you say to me?" Jake shrugged, laughing. "I don't know, man. Maybe I'd ask why a guy like you, if you really were him, is shopping at a tiny store like this instead of some fancy place?" Keanu leaned back, considering the question. "Well, maybe this place has character. Maybe I like the way the old bell jingles when the door opens. Maybe it reminds me of a simpler time before things got complicated." Jake's expression shifted slightly, as if he were starting to piece something together. "That's a very Keanu Reeves thing to say." Keanu grinned. "Is it?" Before Jake could respond, the door opened again and an elderly woman shuffled in, her frail hands clutching a small purse. She moved toward the counter hesitantly, her eyes flicking nervously between Keanu and Jake. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only have $5 and I need to get my medication, but it's a little more than that." Jake sighed, already knowing the store's policy. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. I wish I could help, but my manager's strict about pricing." Keanu didn't hesitate. He turned to Jake, pulling out a crisp $50 bill and placing it on the counter. "That should cover it. And throw in some tea or something warm for her, too." The woman's eyes widened. "Oh, I couldn't." "Please," Keanu interrupted gently, his voice warm with sincerity. "Consider it a small kindness." Jake stood frozen, staring at him. And in that moment, something clicked. The humility, the kindness, the effortless generosity. This wasn't just some guy. The cashier's face turned pale. "Holy crap," he whispered. "You're actually Keanu Reeves, aren't you?" Keanu winked. "You tell me." Jake's mind reeled. He'd spent years watching Keanu's movies, admiring the quiet, grounded persona he carried both on and off screen. And now, here he was, standing in his store, helping a stranger without a second thought. Before he could say another word, Keanu grabbed his water and chocolate, nodded to the woman, and turned toward the door. "Wait," Jake called. "Why'd you do that? I mean, you don't even know her?" Keanu paused, his hand resting on the door handle. Over his shoulder he smiled. Because kindness doesn't need an audience. And with that, he stepped out into the night, the old bell jingling behind him. Jake stood there, staring at the door long after Keanu had disappeared into the rain. The woman clutched her medicine close to her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. And at that moment, Jake realized something. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just wear worn-out jackets and buy chocolate bars at corner stores.